Welcome to the IVM Podcast Network.
How can we use artificial intelligence to improve education? What TV shows should I watch if I want to understand politics? Why were you such a horrible student at school? We'll be talking about all of this and more on the Pragati Podcast. Hello, you're listening to the Pragati Podcast with me, Hamsini, Hariharan. Every fortnight, I sit down with my co-host, Pavan Srinath, to make sense of policy, politics, and economics. So in the first half of today's show, Pavan and I delve into our watch lists for the week. And in the second half, we sit down with Amit Varma, captain and editor-in-chief of Pragati, and Ramez Naam, a renowned futurist, a computer scientist, and award-winning author, to talk about artificial intelligence in education. So Pavan, there's a lot of good programming lately, and I know you're fond of watching good quality shows. Tell me, what exactly is on your watch list now?
So I've tried most of the shows that are out there. I've pretty much seen all of the West Wing. I sat through 2 seasons of House of Cards and then I gave up. But my personal favorite is the show Veep.
Okay.
Among shows that are currently active. So season 6 of Veep is on. It's on HBO. And I think it's one of the best windows into understanding Washington, D.C. politics, even if in a slightly caricatured form.
Okay, so tell me what it's about.
Okay, so let me tell you the premise of the 3 shows, okay, that define sort of West Wing politics or American politics. So the show The West Wing, written by Aaron Sorkin, was the idea of the perfect form of politics, right? Where if you look at politics as different interest groups and different interests sort of being aligned in order to achieve the greater public interest, right? So a lot of the stories were around morally upright people dealing with, intense situations, but, morally guided and somehow try to do the best thing possible and might screw up along the way. So that was the entire premise of the show. So it was very idealistic in that sense. House of Cards is the exact complement to that, in that the House of Cards sort of celebrates the naked exercise of brute power. Or just, so the
brazenness of it.
But it's all about power and how it gets used in sophisticated ways, in crude ways, in all ways, right? So it's about this power couple, Frank Underwood and his wife, and Frank Underwood eventually becomes the president, and how they're ruthless. And so it sort of glamorizes the ruthlessness. And
also the whole Thucydides way of saying the strong will eat and the weak is meat, right?
Yeah. So it's entirely about power and it's exercise. It's about how people can get murdered, people can bumped off. So it's all these interest groups being aligned, but with some element of strong malice involved. And so the driving motivation is not that moral thing, but ambition, like naked lust for power. I think that's a big theme there. But what I find most interesting is a show like Veep, where first of all, the premise is very different. It's such an interesting show because when the show started, you never get to know which party the vice president belongs to. So the show tracks the vice president, Veep. Okay, it tracks the first woman vice president in the US. And there are these discussions about, I've been in endless debates too, about who inspired this character. Some people say Sarah Palin inspired this character. I would like to think that even Joe Biden is not too different from a character like Julia Louis-Dreyfus's Veep. Okay, you might remember her as Elaine from Seinfeld if you're old enough. Okay, so she's the vice president, and the show is interesting because you never get to see the president, and you never know what party she belongs to, and they can conduct a full thing without telling you what party she belongs to. So I think there's a lot of a special technique that has to be used because you never disclose the name. But what I like about this is here it's all about pettiness and ego. So it's not about the grand chase of grand power. There is that ambition, but that politics is typically some sort of a screw up after a screw up. It's this flux of different things happening. It's almost like Guy Ritchie style, Lock, Stock, Two Smoking Barrels, a Snatch, where random events sort of combine and collide and nasty things happen, or things that you think are on track get screwed up for whatever reasons, and ultimately it's people's sort of petty personal feelings that come to the fore.
And you think this is great with respect to politics because...
Absolutely. Because I think there is this idea on both sides that there is this efficiency in exercise of power for good or for evil. But government is a lumbering beast. So you will have an undersecretary who does something, there'll be some rule, and you'll have a event calendar which someone else screws up. There's different types of horse trading that happens between senators and others on bills. And ultimately, it's about gossip and petty egos and people getting slighted and doing stupid things. And ultimately, they're very human in that sense. So imagine a very, very politically charged workplace of, say, 100 people where, people pay petty politics and gossip and so on. The idea is that even in higher circles of power, the same stuff happens. And it's beautiful. So now we're in season 6. I don't want to give too much away, but the vice president does not get along with the president. And, so there are different things that happen over different seasons. And obviously the vice president does have presidential ambitions. And as a role, if you look at the vice president in the US, it's one of the most useless roles there is. If you're the Secretary of State, I mean, there's a reason that Hillary Clinton wanted to be the Secretary of State to Barack Obama and not the Vice President, right? So it's largely powerless. So you see her and her staff trying to be relevant in Washington, D.C., trying to do what they can to get ahead. And I think it's a great, realistic understanding of Washington, D.C.
And how does it compare to The Thick of It?
Okay, so let me tell you about this. So I think this draws from the British tradition of Yes Minister. So Yes Minister was like this, right? I mean, if it was largely random things going wrong and, the bureaucrats trying to do what they can, the politicians trying to do what they can. And Armando Iannucci is this British writer and director who started The Thick of It, which was a modern grunge retelling of Yes Minister. So he did The Thick of It in the UK to sort of look at UK politics and how it happens with one junior minister and his team. And then he came over to cross the Atlantic and he did The Weep. And yeah, I'm sure it's very silly in many respects. It just goes to absurd on many ends. But I still think it gives you a better glimpse into how politics can happen than either of the other shows.
I will put that on my watch list for one.
Yes. You have 6 seasons now.
Oh my God, I have to catch up.
Yes.
So that's it for the first half of the Pragati podcast. In the next segment, we're going to talk to Amit, Varma and Ramez, Naam about education and artificial intelligence.
Hi, I'm May, and I'm a huge fan of the indie music scene in our country. A scene that's relatively underground, even though it sometimes speaks its head overground, but there's no shortage of talent, and I get the privilege of interviewing some of the most awesome musicians on my show. I've had the likes of Euphoria, Krish Kale, Hardcore, Randolph Correa. I've had singer-songwriters, folk singers, electronic music producers, playback singers, rappers, fusion artists, instrumentalists, classical musicians, and so on. Whether mainstream or not, these people have chosen to release their original music, and these are the people currently shaping the direction in which our music scene is heading. Join me on my show every Monday and tune in to discover the unique talent coming out of India today. You can catch Made in India on your favorite podcasting app or our very own IVM podcast app.
Hey, welcome back to the Pragati Podcast. You've heard of photobombing. This is podcast bombing. I'm Amit Varma, and don't worry, Pavan and Hamsini are still here with me, and we have a guest with us. Ramez Naam is a renowned futurist. He's an award-winning science fiction writer. You should check out his Nexus trilogy. And he's here to talk with us about a subject which Pavan and Hamsini have practical experience of: online education. Ramez, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Amit.
We're still quite in the early stages of online education, right? And if you're really talking about reimagining education, it is a lot more than just online. So just to share a little bit about what we do at Takshashila, instead of a physical classroom, we have a virtual classroom that's enabled by Cisco's WebEx. You have physical readings which have long been replaced by online readings for students even in typical universities. And while we do live classes and so on, it is still largely a replica of what's happening in the real world. Even if you take MOOCs offered by Coursera and elsewhere, they're largely still online versions of things that happen in the real world. So what do you see as the real future of education much beyond this?
Well, I think that's a great question. I agree with you. We're just at the very beginning. If I look very far out, fundamentally what we've done is we've taken the cost of content, we've made it zero. So now you can get all the content you want about whatever topic, but the process of teaching is still done by a human. Right. And so can we take that process of teaching, either augment that human teacher's capabilities or replace a large chunk of it with AI that maybe it's not as good as the human teacher in every way, but it can have some advantages. It can be a one-on-one tutor with every student. It can know exactly how well that student is doing, what questions they're getting right and getting wrong. We know that active learning, tailoring the curriculum for just the edge of their competence, accelerates how students do. Can we make it as addictive as video game AIs? Video games are now larger than Hollywood, larger than Bollywood, and they succeed in getting people to spend hours and hours and hours of time doing them because it's fun. Can learning AI turn learning into something that exhilarating and that immersive? That's the kind of questions that I wonder about for the far future.
So you're saying that there is something dramatically different that's possible maybe sometime in the next century, right? Or maybe even sooner. Because if you look at human history, education was first hereditary. I mean, you do what your family did, because the way for you to learn a trade was to do it for years and years and years. And start with the little things and then become a master yourself, and hopefully also do some innovation, right? But the pace of innovation was not very high back in the day. Cut to post-industrial revolution education, where now we had universities that were forming. People were going for a 2-3 year program. They were going to schooling first. And so that has transformed. So what do you see changing? What do you see changing now?
Well, imagine that back in history, control of writing even was very minimal. 1% of humanity was literate in the, let's say 1,000 years ago. And if you wanted to have a book, you had to have a physical person, a monk, transcribe a book from one copy to another by longhand. Then Gutenberg's printing press made it easy, democratized the dissemination of data. But we have not democratized the teaching. So right now, there are more people in India that have a cell phone than have a good physical school to go to.
Right.
So what if all of those kids, imagine that 10 years from now, that cell phone, super cheap smartphone, 100 times more powerful than it is today, 100 times more bandwidth than it is today, has an AI tutor on it that is 80% as good as the best human teacher. And can you just democratize that process? So you just give a kid a device and they start learning in a way that is much cheaper and can reach more people than building schools and providing teachers and so on could today.
And I think at some level you don't really even, it's not even about AI tutors. Technology in a sense can enable redefining what education itself is. Like, because of the limitations of past technologies, what we think of as education is a particular paradigm where you go to school, you have these subjects, they have these syllabuses, it's very clearly defined. You have these learned people with these qualifications who provide the education. But actually, if you think about it, our whole lives we are being educated and we are educating. So in a sense, everyone has something to learn, everyone has something to teach. If, for example, you have a platform where a guy who runs a pawn shop can teach a course on how to run a pawn shop, which is not something you learn in any school or university, why don't you enable those kind of interactions where anyone can be a teacher, anyone can be a student, and most importantly, which is sort of unique to India, everyone can do it for profit.
So Amit, you're saying we need to redefine what education itself means if we want to integrate it into AI? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying it'll necessarily happen if you let the marketplace play itself out. And I'm saying that we can accelerate the process if you simply, why are we using paradigms of the past in the sense, in the way things are taught? Why are these those specific subjects? Why is a syllabi like this? Why are only XYZ, people with XYZ qualifications qualified to teach something? In that sense, all of us in this podcast, all four of us, would have a lot to learn from the other three and a lot to teach the other three. But where are the enabling mechanisms where A, we have the information to understand what that is, and B, the incentives to actually put that into effect? So, going beyond AI for a moment, but looking at technology as an interface that makes all of this possible, is that something that you see happening more of in the future?
I think it certainly could happen. I think there's other benefits beyond. Everything in human technology gets better through competition and experimentation, right? And so when you go to Amazon or you go to Google or you go to any of these online giants, they're constantly also experimenting. They're doing A/B tests, trying 5 variants of their algorithms on you and seeing, are you getting better? We don't do that in schools today. And some of that's technology, but some of it's also we have a monopoly on education. So we take the same model and push it down, and we don't really try a whole lot of new things. So I think anything that facilitates trying out more new ideas in education and measuring the effects is something that can help improve the quality of what we deliver.
So in this, Ramez, what you've been telling us so far is that the access to information and the nature of human access to information has fundamentally changed over the last 2,000 years. But you're saying that a teacher 2,000 years ago roughly did the same thing as a teacher who teaches today, right? I mean, they might have a better textbook, they might have better information, and perhaps slightly better pedagogical tools and, information through research. But the teacher is unchanged, right? So what technology and AI can do is change the process of teaching fundamentally.
Yes, they can augment the teacher or possibly partially replace the teacher. Driver, we talked a lot in a previous podcast about how driving is being replaced by software. But we forget that the word computer, that originally referred to a human being who sat in a room and calculated numbers. So that was an intellectual task. If we can take what teachers do today and make some of it done by software, in some ways, that software will be better than a human. It'll have perfect memory of every student. In some ways, it'll probably be inferior to a teacher. But it will still allow us to, with zero marginal cost, provide that service to anyone on Earth.
And I'd say people often make the mistake of thinking it as an either or. And I don't think that's necessary. I mean, formal education has its own purpose in the sense that you don't just go to a college to learn something. You get a college for the socialization effects, to build those networks which help you later in life. An Ivy League MBA may not necessarily be qualitatively better than an MBA at a lesser school, but it's of far more value because of the signaling value, the networks that you build, and so on and so forth. And one is not saying that online education is going to replace any of this. One is simply saying that online education is going to make knowledge accessible to anyone who wants it. And I often tell people that, man, I wish I was 12 years old today. Because whatever I wanted to learn, I could just go online and learn it.
But, I think that it stems from a fact that we're extremely emotive about education. We're extremely emotive about the people who taught us when we were in kindergarten or who mentored us through college. And I think that would be a problem that a lot of people will raise, as they have done with technology on several other issues. And it's not limited to education alone, right?
I think that's a really good point. Emotion is a big part of who we are. And so we see with MOOCs, with online education, a lot of people don't finish their classes. And so we need hybrid models. Maybe they would do better if they went to a physical schoolroom, even if all the content was being delivered from thousands of miles away, if they just had that moral support or a teacher encouraging them, but you could still have the best lecturer ever in the world delivering that lecture. So I don't think humans will go away.
You guys have a mixed model at Takshashila, right?
Yes. I mean, we decided to stay away from the MOOC model simply because we thought public policy is too nascent a field in India. And a lot of it is very touch and feel. It's easier to teach, say, engineering or mathematics in a way, because if you give the gas laws, PV is equal to nRT, no one's going to come in and say, no, my lived experience of the world says PV is not equal to nRT. Right?
Well, you don't know Donald Trump.
I don't. But at the same time, if you teach someone that, hey, there are things in economics that beat intuition, that trade actually makes both the buyer and seller better off. You're trying to getting people to unlearn things, right? So we've found that a mixed approach to this, where we have some physical interaction, a Q&A, or at least a live discussion online, seems to be far better than purely recorded content.
There's another model being tried in a few places that I've seen called the inverted classroom, where you say, okay, we can now deliver content digitally really well. So instead of having people listen to a lecture in the classroom and then go home at night and do their homework, we will have them listen to the lecture, watch the lecture, maybe with interactive slides and so on, at night on their own device. And then in the classroom, we'll have discussion, and they can do homework and get support and tutorials when the questions answered, peer work. That's another way that's mixed. You still have that emotional satisfaction of working with people, that encouragement from a teacher or from other students. But you take advantage of digital technology is just going to deliver the very best version of the lecture you could possibly have than any teacher can give in person.
So the kid, when he goes to school, instead of saying the dog ate my homework, he'd just say the dog ate my lecture.
Something like that. But again, and this is something that you talked about, Amit, the monopoly on education, and it's particularly strict in India, but it's pretty close to a monopoly in the U.S. as well, stifles the number of these experiments that we get. You know, in the internet world, if you have an idea for a video service that eventually turns into YouTube, no one says you can't do that. Right. It's just you make it, and 9 out of 10 of them fail, but the ones that do really well do well because people love them. And so is there some way to enable more experimentation with education?
So, Pavan, let me then ask you the question, since you know the field fairly well. There's enormous regulation of physical education in India. But if someone tries, say, an online education startup without calling it education per se, are they subject to the same sort of laws and regulations?
So it's a little complex, but any kind of education that spans 1 year, which crosses 365 days, becomes subject to more regulation in the country. So
even online?
Online, offline, it's about the government deciding to take cognizance of you. You know, and once they do,
once you're big enough and profitable enough, they're going to want to slice.
But if you look at some of the innovative things that have happened in the country, the Indian School of Business is one example. So they set up and they said they do not want to deal with India's education bureaucracy. They do not want to give a formal degree of any sort. They want to teach people management. And so they decided to do a course which is just short of a year. And they can get away with anything. And their idea was, we will get market validation. They signed up with the best universities in the world for, accreditation, for course exchange, for faculty exchange. So they were delivering value. Market was recognizing the value. And so they said, I don't want to deal with the government.
Part of the innovation then is figuring out how to circumvent the system.
Yeah. One of my good friends, Vinay, Ainvi on Twitter, has this phrase which says, education is... in India is lying under the shadow of the state. The shadow needs to go away a lot of the times. And you're right, competition and contestability is important, and I think that can solve a lot of the education problems. The good thing in India is there is now more and more competition. It's far from perfect, but it's still not very contestable. You don't know whether school A is better than school B. Yeah. And how can any parent make an informed decision for their child?
And if there's one role for the state, that would be the first role that I would pick. Like student welfare, make sure they're not being abused. But 2, regulate the production of data from any of these institutions on what their outcomes are. You know, what their inputs are, what the students were like, what the outputs are. And then give that as a tool to parents or to... It's not just parents, people who are taxi drivers who lose their jobs. Give that as a tool to them to help them decide what school to go to.
And along with contestability, the challenge with experimentation in education has always been that if you experiment and you fail, you might fail a generation of students. Right? Because because education's always been thought of as this big thing, right? It's a 5-year thing, it's a 4-year thing. So maybe with technology, if the cost of experimentation comes down, and it's a short thing, you teach one skill, one concept, right? And so the cost of failure might also be just that much lower.
And we say that innovation happens at the edges, right? Uber was able to come into existence in Ola because there's a periphery where it was not quite a taxi company. They could skirt some regulation. So you look for the places, tutoring services. I know a lot of Indian families hire tutors. A place like that where maybe you can experiment with that and it's not quite as scary as experimenting with the core of education, but you can still see if you get outcomes.
Right. And people with privilege can be the first movers in trying out new forms of education, right?
Or sometimes people with the least privilege. It might vary from person to person who is most motivated.
I mean, out of absolute necessity. So a friend of mine lives in a town in Bihar and he just came back and he said that within 100 square meters of his house in that small town, which is in Pappu Yadav's district, there are at least 100 signboards offering to teach English. And these are the poorest of the poor who kind of line up. So every morning he passes that street and it's just full of people who've parked their cycles there and they're trying to learn English. From people who barely know English themselves, but there's a market demand and people are kind of coming forward. So a lot of innovation happens from pure necessity.
And you could totally imagine that being something done by AI tutor on your smartphone that is like the just language on tape that we used to have, but interactive with you. That's an app you can completely imagine.
Right.
Ad supported.
And sometimes an app that just talks back to you in the language that you want it to, right? I mean, one of the best ways people learn any language is just by speaking it, right? So if Siri or some other voice agent is just more patient than you or I at speaking English to someone, or with me and trying to learn, say, Kannada better or some other language better. Maybe that's the trick.
I have a theory that my Google Maps, the voice which tells you where to go, it changes from male to female depending on my mood. It senses that. I'm probably wrong, but you never know.
Really like to know your learning outcome.
So I'm going to end with a question for each of you. Tell me one thing that you wish you had learnt when you were a kid. If you had to do it all over again, what would be different about your education? We'll start with the youngest person here. You're barely into adulthood, Hamsini. What would you have liked to learn that you don't know?
When I was still a kid, there was this large perception of negativity towards the sciences. And that was because I didn't understand it. And my teachers were state board teachers. So they just came into class and then they left. And then once I remember asking a question, the teacher looked at me and said, "You're not aiming for a centum, right? Do you really want to know this?" And that perception just put me off.
And it's partly a gender issue as well, right?
Yeah, there is. And like now I can read more, and anything I want to know I can Google, I can find out how to code and things like that. But maybe if I had done that when I was in school, it would have opened me up to a huge new array of things.
Ramez, what about you?
I would have liked to have known the practical impact of things. I was a terrible student. I would have been diagnosed with ADHD if it was a diagnosis back then. But once I'll give you an example, languages. I didn't know why I should learn French. It just seemed absurd to me. Why was I doing this at all? But once I entered my 20s and I started traveling, I began to love languages. I studied Mandarin for 6 weeks so I could go to China and talk to people, and got very, very poor Mandarin, but probably as good as my 2 years of French in that 6 weeks because I was motivated. So that's one thing that for me, for my learning style, would have helped me. It was just to see how this thing I was doing was actually going to affect my life in some way.
I'm a greedy guy, so I'm going to mention two things. The skill I really would have loved to learn is just good coding. You know, I know I did my decent bit of programming through the schools. You know, you do your basic, you do a little bit of C, but I never really got into it. And I think now I'm feeling it. You know, if I could just write scripts of code, I think I would be better off. Second thing, I would agree with you on languages. I was this bullheaded guy in middle school, and I said, I'm going to study Sanskrit. Except I didn't do a good job of that either. And I refused to learn Kannada, which is what I speak at home.
Yeah.
So my felicity with my own mother tongue is not as good as it should be. And I realized that if you learn 2 or 3 languages early on, the 4th language is very easy, even when you're an adult. So now I'm almost a 1.5 language guy, and I'm lesser off for it.
For myself, I wish I'd learned how to play a musical instrument. I'd be sitting in the sun, strumming a guitar and not bothering about boring public policy. Thank you all for being on the show. Had a great time with you guys.
Thanks, Amit.
Thanks, Amit. Alright folks, that's our show for today. You can find new episodes of the Pragati Podcast every fortnight on the IBM Podcast app or any other podcasting app you prefer. And of course, on thinkpragati.com.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. Sorry to say, but there's been a slight delay due to the apocalypse having suddenly begun. As you can see, there's death, destruction, and chaos taking place all around us. But don't you worry, food and drinks will be served shortly, and I would recommend checking out
IBM Podcasts
to get some of your favorite Indian podcasts. We'll keep you going till this whole thing blows over. Thank you.